17-year-old Doña Isabella de Córdoba stood in her family's chapel, hands trembling as she placed them on her belly, feeling the unmistakable movements of a child growing inside her. For 3 months, she had hidden the pregnancy with clever dressmaking and feigned illnesses. But soon, there would be no hiding it. And when her father, Don Cristóbal de Córdoba, discovered that his pure-blooded Spanish daughter carried the child of Mateo, the enslaved mulatto who worked in their household, the revelation wouldn't just destroy 2 lives. It would trigger a massacre so extreme that it would become whispered legend in Havana for generations. Because in colonial Cuba, where racial purity determined everything from your legal rights to your soul's salvation, the idea that a Spanish noblewoman would willingly love an enslaved man wasn't just scandalous. It was an existential threat to the entire colonial system. And Don Cristóbal would respond with violence, designed to ensure no enslaved person in Havana would ever again dare to believe they could cross the barrier between white and black, between master and slave, between human and property. Havana in 1699 was Spain's jewel in the Caribbean, the strategic fortress guarding the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico, the assembly point for treasure fleets carrying gold and silver back to Spain. The city's harbor was constantly filled with ships. Merchants grew wealthy from trade in sugar, tobacco, and enslaved human beings. Grand stone buildings lined the streets, their Spanish Baroque architecture transplanted to the Caribbean, but wealth had created a demographic problem that terrified Spanish authorities. By 1699, Havana's population was approximately 15,000 people, but fewer than 3,000 were pure-blooded Spanish. The rest were enslaved Africans, free people of color, indigenous Cubans, and various mixtures that Spanish society obsessively categorized. The Spanish had created a Casta system, assigning everyone a place based on ancestry. Peninsulares born in Spain sat at the top. Then came criollos, mestizos, mulattos, and dozens of other categories, each with specific legal rights and restrictions. At the bottom were enslaved Africans, who outnumbered free whites in many parts of Cuba. The Spanish lived in constant fear of slave rebellion. To maintain control despite being vastly outnumbered, authorities relied on brutal violence and obsessive enforcement of racial boundaries. Sexual relationships between Spanish women and men of African ancestry were particularly feared because they blurred racial categories the system depended on. If Spanish noblewomen could choose enslaved men, if they produced mixed-race children inheriting Spanish surnames and property, the entire Casta system would collapse. Don Cristóbal de Córdoba understood this perfectly. Born in Seville in 1650, he had arrived in Havana in 1675 as a royal official overseeing sugar exports, a position that made him extraordinarily wealthy. By 1699, at age 49, Don Cristóbal controlled a mansion in central Havana, a sugar plantation worked by 200 enslaved people, and shipping investments generating over 30,000 pesos annually. He was one of Havana's most powerful men, connected to the governor, respected in the church, feared by those below him. His wife, Doña Leonor, had died in 1695, leaving Cristóbal with 2 children. His son, Rodrigo, 21, was studying colonial administration. His daughter, Isabella, 17, represented everything Cristóbal valued about maintaining Spanish purity in the Americas. Isabella had been raised like all Spanish noblewomen of her class, educated in Catholic doctrine and domestic skills, but kept ignorant of anything giving her dangerous ideas about independence. She was meant to marry another Spanish nobleman, produce pure-blooded Spanish children, and perpetuate the racial hierarchy, keeping her family in power. Cristóbal had been negotiating a marriage for Isabella, a union that would combine fortunes. Isabella was beautiful by colonial standards, pale skin never touched by tropical sun, dark hair in elaborate styles. She wore expensive dresses from Spain, attended Mass daily at the cathedral, and obeyed her father in all things, until she made the choice that would destroy everything. Mateo had been born in Havana in 1677, son of an enslaved African mother and a Spanish sailor who raped her and never acknowledged the child. That made Mateo a mulatto, someone of mixed ancestry. His mother named him after Saint Matthew, hoping the Christian name might protect him. By 1699, Mateo was 22, unusually educated because his mother had worked in a priest's household and the priest had taught Mateo to read and write. When the priest died in 1693, Mateo was sold to Don Cristóbal, who needed literate enslaved people to manage household accounts. For 6 years, Mateo worked in the Córdoba mansion, keeping inventory, writing letters, managing domestic staff. He was trusted with responsibilities field workers never received, allowed inside the main house, given access to family spaces, which meant he saw Isabella and she saw him. What happened between them was something colonial Spanish society insisted was impossible. They claimed Spanish women could never be attracted to enslaved men of African ancestry. They claimed racial boundaries were natural, ordained by God. They created laws prohibiting interracial relationships and enforced them with executions and mutilations. But Isabella and Mateo proved that was a lie, that human attraction and love could develop despite every barrier society erected. It started innocently in early 1698. Isabella began noticing Mateo during his work. She noticed his intelligence managing complicated accounting, his careful penmanship, his education despite enslavement. She noticed he treated other enslaved workers with kindness, and she noticed, though she tried not to, that he was handsome, with features showing his mixed ancestry, bronze skin, expressive dark eyes. These were thoughts she knew were forbidden, but they kept surfacing. Mateo noticed Isabella too, though he knew such noticing was suicidal. He saw her intelligence, her musical skill, her kindness to servants when her father wasn't watching. He saw her loneliness, but Mateo understood that any attraction to his master's daughter was deadly. Enslaved men who even looked at Spanish women the wrong way were castrated or executed. In April 1698, circumstance created opportunity. Cristóbal traveled to his plantation for 2 weeks, leaving Isabella with minimal supervision. One afternoon, Isabella encountered a difficult Latin passage and asked Mateo to translate it. It was a moment of transgression, a Spanish noblewoman asking an enslaved person for intellectual help. That first conversation led to others. When Cristóbal was absent, Isabella found excuses to request Mateo's assistance. The conversations became longer, more personal. Isabella shared frustrations about limited education and arranged marriage. Mateo cautiously shared thoughts about literature, while being careful never to criticize slavery directly. Both knew they were playing with fire, but isolation and forbidden attraction drew them closer. By September 1698, they had begun meeting secretly in the library, late at night, when the household slept. They talked for hours. They shared impossible dreams. And somewhere in those conversations, intellectual connection transformed into something deeper. They fell in love, a love that violated every law and custom, a love they both understood could only end in tragedy. In December 1698, their relationship became physical. Isabella, acting on desire, her upbringing insisted, didn't exist in proper Spanish women, initiated an encounter late one night. Mateo, knowing this could result in his torture and execution, chose to meet her passion rather than refuse. For 3 months, they maintained a secret sexual relationship, meeting late at night in hidden spaces. Isabella believed her status protected them. Mateo, trapped between impossible choices, decided brief moments of genuine connection were worth the danger. By March 1699, Isabella realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable: morning sickness, missed cycles, changing body. She was terrified, but also felt strange joy because part of her loved Mateo and wanted his child. She told Mateo in April, and his reaction was immediate horror. "Isabella, they will kill me. Your father will torture me to death in the public plaza. They will take the child and kill it, or sell it into slavery." But Isabella, with naive optimism of someone who'd never faced consequences, believed they could manage it. "We'll go to the church. We'll tell the bishop we're in love, that we want to marry. The church recognizes all Christians have souls regardless of race." Mateo tried to explain why this wouldn't work. The church serves the colonial system. They won't help an enslaved man marry a Spanish noblewoman. But Isabella insisted they had to try. In June 1699, Isabella and Mateo approached Father Antonio Ramirez, a relatively young priest with a reputation for compassion. Isabella confessed the relationship and pregnancy, explaining they loved each other and wanted to marry. She appealed to Christian doctrine about equality of souls before God. Father Antonio's reaction revealed the limits of Christian compassion when it conflicted with colonial hierarchy. He was shocked, not because Spanish women and enslaved men never had sexual relationships that happened constantly through rape and coercion, but because Isabella claimed this was consensual, that she had chosen this. His first concern wasn't Isabella's soul, but the scandal this would create. He told Isabella he needed time to pray for guidance. What he actually did was report directly to Don Cristóbal. When Cristóbal learned the truth in late June 1699, his reaction was volcanic rage mixed with calculated cruelty. His first instinct was to kill Mateo immediately, but he realized that simply executing one enslaved man wouldn't send the message he needed to send. In Cristóbal's mind, Mateo's crime wasn't just touching a Spanish woman. It was daring to believe he could be her equal, daring to imagine love could transcend racial hierarchy, daring to threaten the entire colonial system through his mere existence as Isabella's lover. And if Mateo had dared this, other enslaved people might dare similar transgressions unless they were taught an unforgettable lesson. Cristóbal's plan was methodical and monstrous. He would make an example not just of Mateo, but of every enslaved person who might have known about the relationship and failed to report it. He would turn Mateo's execution into a public spectacle, demonstrating what happened when enslaved people forgot their place. And he would ensure Isabella understood that her moment of choosing love over racial loyalty had consequences extending far beyond her own life. On July 3, 1699, Cristóbal summoned the captain of Havana's city guard and formally accused Mateo of rape. The accusation was legally brilliant in its cynicism. Spanish law recognized that enslaved men could not legally rape Spanish women because the women's lack of consent was assumed. Any sexual contact was automatically rape, regardless of actual circumstances. This meant Cristóbal didn't need to prove Isabella was unwilling. He simply needed to prove sexual contact occurred, which Isabella's pregnancy made undeniable. The legal framework transformed Isabella from willing participant into victim, protecting her reputation while ensuring Mateo's destruction. Mateo was arrested that same day, dragged from the Córdoba mansion to Havana's fortress prison. He was placed in a cell used for the worst criminals, chained to the wall, given minimal food and water. Over the following week, he was interrogated repeatedly, tortured to force confession, and to reveal accomplices. Spanish authorities used techniques perfected over centuries: the rack that dislocated joints, water torture that simulated drowning, burning with hot irons. They wanted names of other enslaved people who had known about the relationship. Mateo, enduring agony that would have broken most people, tried to protect the household staff by insisting he had acted alone, that no one else knew. But the interrogators didn't believe him, convinced there must have been a conspiracy. On July 10th, authorities arrested 15 enslaved people from the Córdoba household, everyone who had worked in the main house where Isabella and Mateo might have been seen together. These people, who had known nothing about the relationship or had suspected but wisely stayed silent, were now accused of conspiracy. They were imprisoned, interrogated, tortured, to extract confessions that didn't exist. An elderly woman named Rosa, who had been Isabella's nursemaid since childhood, died during interrogation when her heart failed under torture. A young man named Luis, who worked in the kitchen, was beaten so severely he never fully recovered. But Cristóbal wanted more than just household staff. He wanted to create such overwhelming terror that every enslaved person in Havana would understand the consequences of threatening racial hierarchy. On July 15th, Cristóbal petitioned the governor for permission to conduct public executions, not just of Mateo, but of all enslaved people deemed complicit. The governor, himself a plantation owner who understood the need to maintain control through terror, approved the request. But he went further, declaring that the executions would be conducted in Plaza de Armas, Havana's main square, and that attendance would be mandatory for all enslaved people in the city. It would be a demonstration, a teaching moment, a ritual sacrifice to the colonial order. On July 20th, 1699, Havana witnessed one of the most brutal public executions in its history. Over 3,000 enslaved people were forced to gather in Plaza de Armas, surrounded by Spanish soldiers, to prevent escape or resistance. The 15 household staff, who had been tortured, were brought out first. They hadn't been convicted of any specific crime beyond being present in a household where racial transgression occurred. But that was enough. Spanish authorities announced they were guilty of conspiracy and would be punished accordingly. 10 of them were sentenced to 100 lashes each, carried out publicly with whips designed to tear flesh. The screams echoed across the plaza, while Spanish officials watched impassively, and enslaved spectators were forced to witness their community members destroyed for crimes they hadn't committed. 5 of the 15, including a woman named Carmen, who had actively tried to warn Mateo to stay away from Isabella, were sentenced to death by hanging. They were executed one by one, while a priest read from scripture about obedience to masters and the wages of sin. Their bodies were left hanging in the plaza for 3 days afterward, as a warning. But the main event was Mateo. His execution had been designed specifically to create maximum terror and suffering. He was brought into the plaza barely recognizable after 2 weeks of torture, dragged to a platform in the center where everyone could see. The charges were read publicly: rape of a Spanish noblewoman, conspiracy against the colonial order, blasphemy for claiming equality with Christians of pure blood. The method chosen was drawing and quartering, an execution reserved for the most serious crimes. Mateo was tied to 4 horses, his limbs attached to each horse. At the signal, the horses were driven in different directions, literally tearing his body apart. The process was intentionally slow to maximize suffering and the terror it produced in witnesses. It took nearly 10 minutes for Mateo to die, while thousands watched in forced silence. His last words, reported by witnesses, were, "Isabella, I forgive you," which Spanish authorities interpreted as confession of her innocence and his sole guilt. Exactly the narrative Cristóbal wanted to establish. After Mateo's death, his body parts were displayed at the 4 entrances to Havana as warnings. His head was placed on a pike at the main city gate, where it remained for 6 months. But the massacre didn't end with the 18 deaths in the plaza. Over the following weeks, Cristóbal used the scandal as justification to conduct a purge of his entire enslaved workforce. Anyone he suspected of disloyalty, anyone who had ever shown independence or intelligence that might threaten his authority, anyone he simply decided he didn't trust, was sold to the sugar mills in the countryside, where working conditions were so brutal that average life expectancy was less than 7 years. In total, over 40 people were removed from Córdoba household, either through execution, torture that resulted in death, or sale to certain death elsewhere. It was collective punishment, a massacre that consumed dozens of lives because 2 people had dared to love across racial lines. Isabella was confined to her room throughout these events, kept under house arrest so she wouldn't witness the violence her relationship had triggered. Cristóbal's handling of his daughter revealed the complicated intersection of patriarchy and racial hierarchy. He couldn't execute Isabella as he had Mateo because she was Spanish, nobility and female, categories that provided protection enslaved men could never access. Spanish law and custom treated her as victim rather than perpetrator, as someone who had been seduced rather than someone who had made choices. But Cristóbal still needed to punish her and ensure she produced no mixed-race heir to the family fortune. In August 1699, Isabella was taken to a convent outside Havana, officially for spiritual retreat, but actually for forced abortion. The procedure, conducted by nuns experienced in handling such situations discreetly for wealthy families, was brutal and nearly killed Isabella. She hemorrhaged severely and developed an infection that left her unable to have children again. For Cristóbal, this was acceptable collateral damage, better a barren daughter than a mixed-race grandchild. Isabella remained in the convent for 2 years, undergoing intensive religious re-education designed to break her spirit and remake her into an obedient Spanish woman who understood that racial hierarchy was divinely ordained. When Isabella finally returned to Havana in 1701, she was a changed person. The lively, curious young woman who had dared to love across forbidden lines had been replaced by someone broken and hollow. She had been forced to publicly confess that Mateo had raped her, that she had been an innocent victim seduced by a devil. She had been made to thank her father for saving her soul by destroying the monster who had corrupted her. And she had been told repeatedly that the deaths of 43 enslaved people were her fault because her sin had made their punishment necessary. The psychological torture was designed to ensure she spent the rest of her life believing she had caused the massacre, rather than understanding that her father's violence had been a choice, not an inevitability. Isabella never married. No Spanish nobleman would accept a woman with her history. She lived the rest of her life in her father's house, essentially a prisoner, performing charity work through the church and maintaining the appearance of pious redemption. She died in 1743 at age 61, having spent 44 years as a living ghost, punished every day for having once believed love could overcome the colonial system's brutality. The massacre of 1699 had exactly the effect Cristóbal and other colonial authorities intended. For decades afterward, enslaved people in Havana told the story to their children as a warning about what happened when you forgot your place, when you dared to imagine being equal to Spanish masters, when you believed human connection could bridge the gulf that Spanish society had constructed. The terror was so effective that there were no recorded cases of Spanish women and enslaved men being caught in relationships in Havana for nearly 30 years afterward. The violence had worked, but the story also became something else in enslaved communities. It became a story about love that was real, despite society's insistence it couldn't exist. It became proof that racial hierarchy was artificial, because if it were natural, Isabella and Mateo wouldn't have been able to love each other. It became evidence that the Spanish colonial system was maintained only through violence, because without the threat of massacre, without the terror of torture and execution, people would naturally form connections across the racial lines that authorities needed to keep absolute. In whispered conversations away from Spanish ears, Mateo wasn't a criminal or a monster. He was a martyr to the possibility of a different world. Don Cristóbal de Córdoba lived until 1721, dying wealthy and respected at age 71. His obituaries praised him as a defender of Spanish honor and Christian values who had purged corruption from his household. The 43 deaths he had orchestrated were mentioned only obliquely as necessary punishment for conspiracy. History, written by Spanish colonial authorities, recorded him as a righteous patriarch rather than a mass murderer. His son Rodrigo inherited the fortune and continued the family's prominence for another generation. But there's another historical record, one that wasn't written down at the time but survived through oral tradition in Havana's black and mixed-race communities. Songs and stories passed from generation to generation, told in the slave quarters and later in free communities after abolition. These versions of the story have different emphases. They remember Mateo as a victim of racist violence rather than a criminal. They remember Isabella not as seductress or victim, but as someone who briefly chose love over the system that empowered her. They remember the 43 dead as martyrs to Spanish paranoia rather than criminals receiving just punishment. And they remember the massacre of 1699 as proof that colonial authorities feared love across racial lines, precisely because such love demonstrated that the hierarchy they claimed was natural was actually maintained only through terror. The story of Isabella, Mateo, and the 43 became part of Cuban historical memory, resurfacing during independence movements in the 19th century when Cubans were fighting to free themselves from Spanish control. Anti-colonial activists used the story to argue that Spanish rule had always been based on violence rather than legitimate authority, that the same system that massacred 43 people for one man's relationship with a Spanish woman would inevitably massacre Cubans seeking independence. The story was invoked during debates about abolition in Cuba, which didn't come until 1886, as evidence that slavery corrupted everything it touched, destroying not just enslaved people, but also free people who tried to challenge it. Today, the Plaza de Armas, where Mateo was drawn and quartered, is a tourist destination, a beautiful colonial square surrounded by museums and cafes. There's no memorial to what happened there in July 1699. The official historical markers discuss Spanish architecture and colonial trade, but they say nothing about public executions or massacres. But if you ask elderly Cubans, particularly those whose ancestors were enslaved in colonial Havana, they know the stories. They can point to the exact spot where Mateo died and tell you that his blood, along with the blood of 43 others, soaked into the stones that tourists now walk across without knowing the history beneath their feet. The love scandal of Havana, 1699, stands as one of the most brutal demonstrations of how colonial racial hierarchies were maintained through terror. It reveals that when enslaved people and their masters' families formed genuine human connections, when they dared to love across the artificial boundaries that colonial society insisted were natural, the response wasn't debate or negotiation, but immediate, overwhelming violence. The massacre wasn't an aberration or an excess of passion. It was policy, a calculated demonstration designed to ensure that racial boundaries remained absolute by making the consequences of crossing them so horrifying that no one would dare try again. This is history's most tragic love story, where two people's choice to love each other, despite every prohibition, resulted in a massacre consuming 43 innocent lives, where a father's commitment to racial purity mattered more than his daughter's happiness or dozens of human lives, where colonial authorities used torture and execution not to punish actual crimes, but to defend a social hierarchy they knew was artificial and could only be maintained through terror. This is the story history tried to forget, but one that must be remembered if we're to understand the true cost of the racial hierarchies that shaped the Americas and continue to echo in our world today.